They called it the Cliff of Gold, not because it was rich in minerals, not because it gleamed in sunlight, though it did, in a way that made the ocean blush beneath it. It was called that because of what it represented: untouched, untamable, priceless. You wouldn't know that standing beside the man who flew in that morning, stepping out of his helicopter in polished leather shoes that had never touched wet sand in their life. His name was Victor Langston. You might have read it on glossy magazine covers or seen his quotes stitched into LinkedIn posts about ambition and dominance. Real estate tycoon, billionaire, empire builder. But this story isn't about his empire. He arrived with a smile, one of those confident, tight-lipped grins that says, "I've already won." His assistant, a young man who looked like he'd never missed a networking event in his life, handed Victor a tablet. 3 miles of prime coastline, zoned for development. All of it's locked in, except that one plot. He pointed toward the very edge of the cliff. Victor didn't even squint. "That one shack?" "Yes, sir." The assistant tapped the screen. "Technically, it's owned. A fisherman. Lives alone. Name's Elias Marin. He's refused every offer." Victor let out a soft chuckle. This will be the easiest acquisition yet. The helicopter blades spun in the distance as they began the short walk toward the bluff. You could hear the waves long before you saw them, crashing like they were arguing with the rocks, like the sea was furious it couldn't climb higher. And there it was, a crooked little structure that looked like it was held together by memories and sea salt, driftwood walls, a rusted tin roof, and smoke lazily curling from a chimney that didn't seem to know it was defying gravity. There was a man sitting outside, weathered, like the land. His face was the kind people don't forget, not because it was famous, but because it had endured things most never would. Victor raised an eyebrow. "That's him?" "Elias Marin, 62. Lost his wife 10 years ago. No known family since." Victor adjusted his jacket, stepped forward, and extended a perfectly manicured hand. Elias didn't shake it. He simply looked up and said, "You're here about the shack." Victor nodded. "I want to make you an offer." Elias stood slowly, his joints creaking like the old wood beneath him. "You won't be the first?" Victor laughed, not unkindly. "Then maybe I'll be the last." They stood there for a long second, the sea screaming behind them, gulls circling above like ghosts waiting to speak. Victor glanced around. "Beautiful view. We're going to build something spectacular here. 5-star resort, infinity pools, spa built into the cliff. People will fly in from all over the world just to feel this breeze." Elias turned to the sea. "Funny how money makes you believe you can own the wind." Victor didn't flinch. "I'm offering you a better life. You could buy a place in town, get away from the storms." Elias finally looked him in the eye and said nothing. Victor smiled again, but this time there was something different behind it. A flicker of confusion, of challenge. "You're really going to say no?" Elias nodded once. "I'm not selling." Victor's assistant stepped forward, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We can make it worth your while. You name it. Money, relocation, anything you want." Elias's voice was quiet. "I already have everything I want." Victor's smile cracked for just a moment, and something in the air shifted. You know that feeling when a storm is still a few miles out, but your bones already feel wet? That was the cliff in that moment. Something had changed, and Victor, who had built towers on deserts and carved villas into mountains, felt, for the first time in a long time, that maybe not all land could be conquered. He didn't say it, of course. He simply turned, adjusted his jacket again, and walked back toward the helicopter. "Get him the paperwork," he said to his assistant. "He'll change his mind." But as the rotors began to spin and the wind whipped around them, Elias stood firm on the bluff, alone, silent, watching, because that shack wasn't just a home, and the cliff wasn't just dirt. Victor would learn that soon enough, but not yet. The next time I saw Victor Langston on the cliff, he wasn't smiling. He came back in a tailored suit that looked allergic to sea spray, walking beside a man who introduced himself as a legal representative. Clipboard, briefcase, confidence. The kind of man who believed paper could undo a person's history. Elias was seated in the same spot as before. Same chair. Same quiet gaze cast out to the restless water. His hands were wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam rising from it in soft, slow spirals. He didn't flinch when they arrived, didn't stand, just watched the sea. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Marin, we represent Mr. Langston regarding a formal acquisition of this land. We're prepared to offer a settlement." Victor stood slightly behind, hands in his pockets, gaze shifting between the shack and the lawyer's clipboard. Elias sipped his drink. "You already offered once." "This is more official," the lawyer said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And more generous." He handed Elias a document. The number was printed in bold. It wasn't generous, not really. Not for oceanfront property. Not for a place that had weathered time and tide for decades. It was a number meant to insult with courtesy. Victor finally spoke. "Buy a little cottage inland, dry walls, plumbing, peace. You don't have to live like this." Elias set the paper down without a glance. "I'm not selling." The words weren't sharp. They weren't stubborn. They were simply full. Full of something none of them could quite define. Victor gestured toward the structure. "Look, I'm not a monster. We'll pay to move it plank by plank if it matters that much to you. You can even have a spot in the resort for free. But this land, it's going to change. You can either be a part of that or in the way of it." Elias tilted his head. "In the way?" Victor's jaw tightened. "Let's not turn this into a problem. I'm offering solutions." "I'm offering none," Elias replied. "Just truth. I'm not selling." Something flickered behind Victor's eyes, something small and venomous. He stepped closer. "I'm being civil now, but I have lawyers, city permits, noise, dust, trucks, machinery. I can make it so you won't be able to sleep here, let alone live." Elias stood, slowly. His eyes never left Victor's. "Is that your solution?" he asked, voice calm. "Choke the peace out of a man until he crawls away with whatever scraps you leave?" Victor exhaled hard. "It's business." Elias nodded once. "And this is home." There was a silence then, one heavy enough to bend the sky. Victor turned to the lawyer. "We'll give him a few days to think. Then we proceed." They walked away. Not a word more exchanged. But as they did, I saw Elias pick up the paper with the offer on it. He folded it twice, walked over to the fire pit beside his shack, and let the flames take it. No ceremony, no rage, just quiet ash. Later that night, Victor sat in his rented villa a few miles down the coast, staring out into the dark water. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was confused. He'd bought out entire villages, entire nations, practically. And here was a man with a shack and a rusted chimney, saying no? To him? He didn't know it yet, but that single no was the first crack in the wall he'd spent a lifetime building around himself. And cracks? Cracks always let the light in. It was the silence that broke him. Not the rejection, not the resistance, not even the stubborn way Elias refused every offer Victor threw at him. It was the silence that followed it all. The kind of silence that doesn't come from stubbornness, but from deep, soul-rooted pain. A week had passed since Victor's last attempt, and something had shifted, not just in Elias, but in Victor, too. He wasn't sleeping well, He couldn't stop thinking about the way Elias folded that paper offer and fed it to the fire like it meant less than nothing. Men like Victor didn't get told no. Not by governments, not by kings. And yet here was this lone fisherman, holding his ground like his shack stood on bedrock deeper than law. And maybe it did. Victor came alone this time. No suits, no lawyers, no clipboard promises. Just a man who couldn't let go of a mystery. He found Elias sitting on the same weathered bench. The tide was low, revealing dark, jagged rocks below the cliff's edge. Victor approached quietly. "May I come in?" Elias didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he nodded. The shack creaked as Victor stepped inside. It smelled of salt, wood smoke, and something older, like history that refused to fade. Inside, it was small, cramped, but everything had been touched by hand. Carved shelves, worn cushions, a wooden table with initials etched into one corner, faded photos in crooked frames, tools arranged not for show, but for use. Elias walked in behind him, set down a kettle on the stove, and pointed toward a photo hanging on the far wall. A young man, late teens, maybe early 20s, wild hair, bright eyes, grinning like someone who trusted the world too much. "My son," Elias said quietly. "He built this place." Victor said nothing. The air didn't want words. It wanted witness. Elias sat down across from him. His hands trembled slightly as he held a worn mug. "I had no plans to stay here forever," he began. "Bought this land when it was worthless. Just a stretch of rock nobody wanted. Thought I'd fish a while, then sell it off and disappear." He paused, looked out the small window toward the sea. "But then Matthew came here. My boy, young, brave, said he wanted to help, build something with me. I thought he'd last a summer. But he stayed. He saw something here, something I didn't. He saw peace." Elias stood, walked over to the shelf, and picked up a small wooden carving. A whale, hand-carved, beautiful. He built this shack with his own hands, every beam, every nail, every inch. He said, "It's not much, Dad, but it's ours." Elias smiled faintly, holding the carving like it might break. 2 years ago, he said softly, a storm rolled in. Like none I've ever seen. Sharp winds, black sky, and a tourist boat stranded just off the rocks. No way for rescue to reach in time. Victor leaned forward. He could feel it coming. Whatever had buried itself in Elias's silence was clawing its way out. My son didn't hesitate. Took the boat out before I could stop him. He knew those waters, knew how to ride the waves, and he did. He got to them, all of them. 8 tourists. He brought them in, one trip at a time. Elias's voice cracked. But on the last run, the storm changed. He didn't make it back. The shack seemed to exhale. The walls felt smaller. The waves outside crashed louder. They found his body washed up 2 days later, near those rocks. Elias pointed out the window to a jagged cluster half submerged in tide. His hands were still clenched on the oars. Victor said nothing. What could he say? The room was a tomb, a memory turned into shelter, a grave that breathes. I couldn't leave, Elias whispered. Couldn't tear this place down. Every plank, he touched it. Every scratch in the wood is a moment we lived. It's not just a shack. It's the last thing he gave me. He turned to Victor, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only the kind of grief that reshapes a man. I don't expect you to understand, but I need you to see. Victor looked around again, really looked. The framed photo, the carvings, the initials on the table, the silence between waves, and for the first time in his life, the man who built towers, who paved over forests and replaced them with marble, realized there were some places that should never be bought. Some places were not made for profit. Some were made for memory. The next morning, Victor Langston didn't show up to the construction meeting. Not because he forgot, not because he didn't care, but because something in him had shifted, and he didn't know how to name it. He had spent the night staring out the window of his luxury rental, watching the waves claw at the cliffs. In his hand was a photo he had quietly snapped with his phone. Elias's son, Matthew, smiling from the old frame on the shack's wall. Victor had told himself for decades that sentimentality was a weakness, that the world was made of movers and the moved. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure which one he was anymore. He barely noticed when his assistant, Darren, stepped into the room with a tablet in hand. "I looked into it, sir," Darren said. "The storm Elias talked about. It happened." Victor turned slowly. "Details?" 2 years ago, October 19th, sudden nor'easter. A tourist boat capsized offshore. Emergency crews couldn't reach in time due to the wind. One man, Matthew Marin, took a skiff into the water multiple times. Saved 8 people. Victor's throat tightened. Darren continued. There were articles. One in the Times called him the lone sailor of salvation. A couple of tourists even came back later to dedicate a plaque on the harbor wall. No idea if Elias ever went to see it. Victor closed his eyes. That smile in the photo wasn't just a memory. It was legend carved into the tide. And yet, all that remained was a crooked shack and a father who refused to forget. Later that afternoon, Victor found himself standing near the edge of the property line, alone. He could see Elias down below, on the rocks near the water. The tide was rising, creeping closer to his boots. In his hand was a small bouquet, wildflowers, wilting slightly. Elias knelt near a jagged outcrop and gently set the flowers down. He whispered something. Victor couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The wind carried them to the sea like it already knew the message. Back at the shack, Elias sat for hours without moving. Not asleep, not resting, just listening, as if the ocean was telling him something only he could understand. Victor watched from a distance, invisible behind the tinted windows of a black SUV. But even from there, the weight of it struck him. The silence, the grief, the loyalty to a son long gone. For the rest of the day, Victor didn't return calls, didn't respond to emails. He walked the perimeter of the property, sometimes stopping to run his hand over the bark of a tree or pick up a stone that looked out of place. That night, he stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time he'd visited his son's grave. He couldn't. He remembered the funeral, remembered the press, remembered the stock price drop, the PR team trying to spin the tragedy. But he couldn't remember the last time he stood alone beside the headstone. Couldn't remember the last time he said his son's name aloud. Somewhere along the way, Victor had turned pain into concrete and glass. But Elias? Elias had turned it into wood, salt, silence, and love. And somehow, it had lasted longer. The next morning, Victor stood outside the shack again. He didn't knock, didn't speak. He just listened to the wind, the waves, and the voice in his mind that no longer sounded like a businessman. It sounded like a father. The bulldozers arrived at sunrise. No warning, no paperwork, just steel and diesel rolling over the earth like it had already been claimed. The roar of engines shattered the morning quiet. Birds scattered from the trees. The sea seemed to retreat, sensing what was coming. Victor wasn't there, but his signature was. The machines lined up in formation like soldiers awaiting orders. Bright yellow beasts with cold hearts. Hired men in neon vests surveyed the land, mapping out where to dig, where to break, where to flatten the memories buried beneath the soil. And there, alone on the edge of the cliff, stood Elias. He didn't yell, didn't protest, didn't even move from where he stood. His hands wrapped around an old fishing rod that had been leaning beside the shack since that first day Victor saw him. The rod was worn, the reel rusted, but he held it like it was made of gold. The crew was told one thing: don't touch the shack. At least, not yet. The rest? Fair game. The chainsaws started with a violent scream. Trees fell, roots ripped, ground trembled. Every thud echoed like a drumbeat of war against the quiet world Elias had built. One worker, young, barely 20, paused when he saw Elias standing there. "Hey, you okay, sir?" Elias didn't respond. He just walked toward the cliff's edge, slowly, carefully. He placed the fishing rod down in the dirt, the exact spot his son used to cast from. Then he turned, walked back to the shack, and closed the door. Inside, the walls shook with every blow to the land. But Elias didn't flinch. Outside, the men cleared earth by the ton, dragging away pieces of the wild that had stood untouched for decades. The cliff groaned under the weight of machines and intentions. That night, as the last excavator shut down and the workers packed up, the wind began to shift. It started softly, a whisper, a chill, but to Elias, it was more than wind. It was warning. He stepped outside, looked up at the clouds. Dark, fast-moving, swirling in a way that didn't belong. His bones, older than any forecast, screamed what was coming. He grabbed his lantern and walked half a mile down the trail to the trailers where the construction crew was camped for the night. Most were inside, eating, laughing, exhausted from the day's labor. Elias knocked once, twice, then again, harder. One man opened the door. "Something wrong?" "Storm's coming," Elias said simply. "Get them off the cliff." The man looked at the sky, shrugged. "Forecast says scattered rain." Elias shook his head. "This isn't scattered. It's coming. Like the one that took my boy." That made the man pause. "You sure?" "I've lived here 40 years, Elias said. "I know the sound the sea makes when it's scared." The man looked past Elias toward the horizon. The sky now churned with electric veins, lightning far off. Silent for now, but not for long. He didn't wait for permission. He ran back inside, called it out. Others looked, saw it too. Within minutes, the trailers were lit with frantic motion, gear packed, radios buzzing, engines coughing to life. By midnight, the storm hit. Not rain, not wind, wrath. Waves slammed the cliffside like fists. Tents were shredded. Equipment was tossed like toys. Lightning struck the trees they hadn't yet cut down, splitting them open with screams that rivaled the thunder. And yet, no lives were lost, because of a warning, because of an old man who still remembered what loss sounded like before it came. The next morning, the damage was everywhere. Mudslides, twisted metal, a generator half swallowed by a collapsed trench. But no body bags. Victor arrived just after dawn, his SUV crawling through the wreckage. He stepped out into silence. No one greeted him. No one smiled. And at the cliff's edge, where the fishing rod still stood, untouched by the storm, Elias was already there. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He just stared at the sea, as if waiting for it to give something back. Victor didn't know it yet, but something inside him had been broken by that storm. And maybe, just maybe, something else had finally begun to heal. Victor came alone this time. No convoy, no clipboard entourage, no one to manage optics or spin headlines, just him. A man no longer dressed like he owned the world, but like he was trying to remember how to belong in it. The cliff was still scarred, trees splintered, soil uprooted, bulldozers half buried in mud. But the shack, that little weather-worn monument, remained untouched. Somehow, it looked stronger now than it ever had. Elias sat out front, sanding a block of wood with the same quiet rhythm he always had. He didn't look up when Victor approached. He didn't need to. Victor stood there for a long time before speaking, hands in his pockets, heart in his throat. "I made a mistake," he finally said. Elias paused, but didn't respond. Victor took a step closer. "I thought if I kept building things, it would fix something in me, that it would patch over the cracks." Still, silence. "But I realized last night, some cracks aren't meant to be filled. They're meant to be remembered." Now Elias looked up, and what he saw wasn't the same man who had arrived weeks ago with a helicopter and a smirk. What he saw was a man with eyes that had finally turned inward. Victor sat down on the edge of the deck. "My son died 12 years ago," he said. "Fentanyl. His roommate found him in their dorm. He was just 19. The words fell into the ocean air like stones into deep water. "I was too busy," Victor continued. "Meetings, mergers. I missed his last call. Thought it could wait till Monday." Elias said nothing, but the sanding block slipped from his hand and landed softly on the wooden planks between them. Victor stared out at the sea. "I built towers after that. Dozens. Poured money into things I didn't care about. Bought a yacht the size of a building. People called it grief. I called it legacy. But it was just escape." He took a breath that didn't come easily. "And then I met you." Victor finally turned to Elias. "I thought you were stubborn, sentimental, foolish even, holding on to a shack like it was sacred. But now I understand. It is. It's a temple made of memory, and I tried to tear it down." Elias looked down at his hands. "They don't understand," he said quietly. "The ones who haven't lost something that can't be replaced." Victor's voice cracked. "I do now." The two men sat in silence. No need to fill it. The ocean did that for them. After a long pause, Elias spoke again. "You don't have to fix it, Victor. You just have to feel it." Victor wiped at his eyes, the kind of motion a man makes when he's not used to crying, when the weight of it surprises him. And there, in the shadow of a broken construction site, under a sky that looked ready to rain again, two fathers sat shoulder to shoulder. Not as buyer and seller, not as tycoon and fisherman, but as two men who had both outlived their sons and had finally found someone who understood what that meant. The permit was shredded. Victor didn't even wait to get back to his office. He sat in his SUV at the edge of the construction site, rolled the paper between his fingers, and tore it down the middle. Twice. Then again, until all that remained were pieces too small to read, too meaningless to matter. He didn't speak, just handed the scraps to his assistant and said, "We're not building here." The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was disbelief. "But sir," the assistant stammered, "investors are expecting—" "Let them expect something else." And that was the end of it. Victor Langston, the man who turned deserts into skylines, walked away from the cliff and told no one why. But we know. A month later, the noise stopped. The machines disappeared. The torn land began to heal. Wild grass reclaimed the cuts. Trees creaked softly in the wind, stretching back into their place. The cliff no longer echoed with drills and orders, but with birdsong and tide. Elias remained. The shack remained. But something new began to grow. Quietly, reverently. A stone path, winding from the trailhead to the water's edge. A bench carved from driftwood, placed near the rocks where Elias's son had once vanished. A plaque, modest and brushed in bronze, etched with 8 names, those who had lived, and one name beneath them, Matthew Elias Marin, who gave his hands to the sea and his heart to strangers. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press conference, just visitors, week by week, drawn by something wordless. They came, not knowing exactly what they'd find. Some brought flowers, some brought silence, and some brought their own pain. quietly letting it settle on the rocks like it had found a home. Victor never spoke publicly about the change, but he came, always quietly, always alone. First, it was once, then again, 6 months later. Then every year, without fail. Each time, he'd park near the tree line, walk the path slowly, his hands buried in his coat pockets. At the edge of the cliff, he'd sit beside Elias. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they wouldn't. One spring morning, he brought a small potted plant, red carnations, planted them near the base of the shack, beside Elias's son's old fishing rod, which still stood upright in the earth like a flag refusing to fall. Elias said nothing. Victor looked out at the sea and whispered, "This is the only place I feel like a father." Elias turned to him, eyes lined but steady. "That's because this is where you finally stopped building and started remembering." Victor nodded, and the wind moved gently through the grass,